Chris Carberry is CEO and co-founder of Explore Mars Incorporated and helped to turn that organisation into one of the most influential space non-profits in the world. Previous to his role with Explore Mars, Carberry served as Executive Director of the Mars Society, as well as the Archivist of Modern Political Collections and Operations Manager at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Carberry has been quoted in numerous national, US and international news stories, has published hundreds of opinion pieces, and has testified before both the United States Senate and House of Representatives. Carberry is the author of the recently published book, Alcohol in Space.
All right, well, thank you for having me on. Thank you to the British Interplanetary Society. I'm Chris Carberry. I'm CEO of a group called Explore Mars, which is a nonprofit based in the United States, but we do activities all around the world, as you can imagine by the title of the group, focused on getting humans to Mars. However, I also released a book back in late October 2019 called Alcohol in Space, Past, Present, and Future. I know it's a very crazy title for a book, but it actually is a real topic, and there are an awful lot of people working on this topic right now to make alcohol in space a reality, and actually it already is a reality, and I'll go into that during the course of the talk. Just a little bit of background beyond the book, about the book, before I bring up my slides. I've been thinking about this for a long time within the space community. Often if we go to a bar or a pub after a space event, we'll often talk about, after a couple of drinks, would it be possible to make wine on Mars or beer on Mars? And what would it taste like? Since we know that wine absorbs the tastes of the soil here on Earth, called terroir, would that happen on Mars? So it would taste rusty? And so I thought, lightheartedly, I wanted to write an article on it that would be not entirely seriously, but really look at the topic. But the more and more I looked at it, I realized there were real companies looking at whether you could manufacture and consume alcohol in space. And the more I looked, I realized there's more than enough here for a book, so I might as well be the first one to do it. So Alcohol in Space, the book came out in October. And as you see by the book cover, Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, did the forward for me. Andy loves mixing his own cocktails, so he was more than happy to write the forward for this book. So just a little bit of background before I go, get into some depth here. But there's a lot of news recently, in the news recently about alcohol in space. You may recall back in November 2019, 12 bottles of Bordeaux were launched up to ISS, the International Space Station, for an aging experiment. And they're not alone. There are actually, to my count, I believe there are 3 or 4 alcohol-related experiments on the International Space Station at this time. However, before I get to that, I want to provide some context. We know that, of course, alcohol has been a pivotal part of human civilization from the very beginning. We have evidence of intentional fermentation over 10,000 years ago, and all through human history, it's played an integral part in the development of civilization, particularly in agriculture. Many scientists believe that the desire to have a drink helped advance agricultural technology probably more than the desire to eat. So in many ways, you can thank alcoholic production for civilization itself. But also in exploration. We all know that rum and other beverages have been integral parts of exploration and maritime history and naval history. Obviously, the British Navy had rum as part of its stipend for the crews until actually fairly recently. And it was an important part of maintaining morale throughout history. But one of the more famous examples more recently, late 19th century, early 20th century, were Ernest Shackleton's missions. Famously, several cases of whiskey were found in Antarctica several years ago, and they created an imitation of that, which they sold as Shackleton whiskey. However, on that particular mission, the Nimrod mission, as you see in the screen, he brought an awful lot of alcohol with him. For only a crew of about 12 to 16, he brought 25 cases of whiskey, 12 cases of brandy, and 6 cases of port. So more than enough for any of the crew members. And Shackleton was quoted as saying, "If I had not had some strength of will, I would have made a first-class drunk." Of course, by today's standards, Shackleton probably was a first-class drunk. Even in exploration missions today, alcohol plays a key role. This is actually Club 90 South in Antarctica. It's one of several bars that are actually in the research stations down in Antarctica. And I always imagine this to be one of the first Mars bars will look like. Just kind of a hole in the wall where people get together at the end of the day and have a drink. So I always imagine this like you'd have on the moon or Mars at the very beginning. But alcohol has also been depicted in science fiction from the very beginning. People like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells mentioned it in their early works. Actually, Jules Verne and From Earth to the Moon, actually the crew members hypothesized about making wine on the surface of the moon. And they actually brought, in the book, they actually brought wine grapevines, hoping to grow grapes to make wine on the surface of the moon. And it was interesting because I believe this was actually the first time that anybody had ever speculated about growing grapes or any kind of agriculture on the moon, at least in a scientific manner. So he was way ahead of his time, and actually just about 100 years later, and I'll get to this a little bit later, wine would in fact be on the moon. And H.G. Wells, in The First Men in the Moon, well, he didn't bring alcohol with him. They speculated or actually longed for beer when they were on their voyage to the moon as well. But when they were on the surface or in the caves on the moon, they actually got stoned on lunar mushrooms. So they got there anyway. I apologize for this redacted image here. Normally there's a picture from Star Trek here, but I don't own the rights to it. But as I mentioned, throughout, in science fiction books, alcohol has played a major role. But as we know, in franchises like Star Trek with the 10 Forward Bar, or Star Wars with the Cantina Bar, and pretty much any science fiction television or movie that you can think of, there's usually some form of alcohol or bar. And science fiction writers generally just have assumed that alcohol will be part of life in the future, as it has been in the past. So, there actually has been an interesting history of drinking in space. This isn't something new. Almost from the very beginning, alcohol has played a role in human space exploration. This image here is actually more of a joke. You have Tom Stafford here and Deke Slayton on a mission on the Soyuz Apollo missions, where they have their borscht tubes that are actually labeled vodka. There was not actually vodka in it, but in fact, there has been quite a bit of alcohol in space. Let me bring this up. On the first alcohol going into space was not consumed, though. Even on Apollo 8, 3 bottles of brandy were actually sent up for the holiday meal. You may remember Apollo 8, when they orbited the moon, it was around the Christmas time. So they sent a special holiday meal, and I believe it was Deke Slayton who snuck up 3 bottles, packed 3 bottles in their meals as a joke. He didn't expect them to drink it. But the commander of the mission, Borman, was, well, let's say, not too pleased, and was angry that it was sent up, because if they drank any of it and something went wrong with the mission, they would blame the brandy. Jim Lovell, who was also on this mission, thought he had overreacted, said that they would never have consumed it anyway, but he thought Borman had overreacted. But many years later, of course, he brought it back to Earth and was able to sell this bottle of brandy that actually circled the moon for a fairly large amount of money. I believe it was close to $20,000, if I remember off the top of my head. I should have had it on my slide. However, a few months later, some alcoholic beverages were actually consumed in space. Buzz Aldrin, when he landed along with Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon, brought along with him some communion wine in a goblet. He had arranged for this with his church in Texas, the Webster Presbyterian Church near Houston. And they had arranged to bring this goblet, the wine, and once the public statements had been finished, after one giant leap for mankind, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, Buzz made some public statements. But after the camera and radio were off, Buzz performed a communion prayer where he poured the wine into this goblet, and he describes it in some of his books of the wine going down slowly in the goblet in the 1/6 gravity, and saying a few prayers and drinking the wine. And I believe to this day he is the only person to ever drink an alcoholic beverage on another planetary body. And every year, the Webster Presbyterian Church does a special service honoring the first moon mission and the first communion prayer done on the moon. Yeah, alcohol in space didn't finish there, although this wine did not get up there, or this sherry did not get into space. When the United States decided to start the Skylab program, they thought they wanted to make it a home away from home, and to do that, they thought it would be great to send up wine. And so they started this whole project of looking at what sorts of wines would be appropriate to be sent into space. It needed to be a really stable wine, because if you shake your wine too much, you could damage your wine. So as you know, when you launch anything into orbit, it's going to be shaken quite a bit and go through a lot of basically a lot of circumstances that would not be beneficial to your wine. So they're trying to find a wine that was as stable as possible. They finally decided on this Parmesan rare cream sherry, and they had every intention of adding it to the menu, but it was removed from the menu for two reasons. First, they needed to test it on the Vomit Comet. And because the Vomit Comet has the name the Vomit Comet for a reason, when they went there and opened up the sherry bottle, it lingered with the aroma that was inherent to the Vomit Comet. It's named the Vomit Comet for a reason, and that did not go well. And then word got out from NASA, for some reason to the press, that wine would be going up to ISS, and then there was a bit of a public outcry, so they decided to remove it from the menu. So at that point in time, generally alcohol was restricted from NASA space flights. It had not been officially restricted until around that time period. At the moment, even to current day, it's officially prohibited. So the sherry never went into space, but plenty of alcohol has gone into space and has been consumed, even though every space agency has an official prohibition in space. There actually has been an interesting history on such space stations as the Mir Space Station and even the International Space Station with consumption of alcohol. This is the only known image of alcoholic consumption in space. This image was taken shortly after the fire on the Mir space station. As you can imagine, that was a stressful day, and they needed a little bit of a drink after. But this is a very difficult image to find. As you notice, it's not a very good quality image. This one, while NASA owns it, they never can seem to find it. And so I was only able to find this grainy image on the internet. But there has been an awful lot of consumption of alcohol, but to my knowledge, nobody has ever gotten inebriated. It's always been responsible drinking. And while a lot of people ask me or tell me, I bet there's a lot of vodka in space, in fact, the drink of choice in space is cognac. And so the Russians have been smuggling up cognac for many, many years. And it hasn't been just the Russians that have been consuming it. The Americans and pretty much every nationality has consumed the alcohol, and it's played an interesting role. When there's a special occasion, for instance, a new crew comes up to the International Space Station, there many times they get together in the Russian portion of the station, and they squirt out these little orbs, these little shots that are floating in air of cognac, and do a shot. And this has served a very, very important role. It's a bonding experience and helps them bond with these international crews that come from extremely diverse backgrounds and sometimes come from countries that aren't getting along very well. We've had sometimes not particularly great relations with Russia, meaning the United States and Russia, over the last few years. It's gone up and down. And so space has served a unique role to keep the countries together. And I think these alcoholic toasts have served a very important role. However, the thing that really motivated the book was the large number of companies and organizations that are actually investing in the prospect of manufacturing and consuming alcohol in space. Perhaps my favorite of these is Ardbeg, the Scottish whiskey producer. I'm a big Scotch drinker, and Ardbeg has been my favorite Scotch for many years. I love big smoky Scotches. And even before I knew they had a space connection, one Friday evening when I was sipping my Ardbeg, I was looking at their Facebook page, and it was covered with space pictures. And I thought this was rather weird. So I looked them up and realized that they had sent an experiment into space. In fact, they sent the first whiskey aging experiment to ISS in 2011, stayed up there for several years, came back down in 2015, and they did in fact find, and it was sent up by Nanoracks, a company here in the United States, and they did in fact find a difference between the space-flown sample of Ardbeg and the ground sample that resided in Houston, I believe. And apparently, it wasn't any better. It had basically a fishy overtone, from what I recall, and an antiseptic taste. So it was not an improvement. However, they don't know if this was really because of the inherent nature of microgravity or the fact that it wasn't handled well. It stayed up there much longer than it was supposed to, and the handling wasn't very conducive to a well-conducted experiment. However, in 2015, the same year that the Ardbeg experiment came back down, another whiskey producer sent up experiments to the International Space Station. Suntory, the Japanese whiskey maker, sent up a couple experiments. One that's already come back down to Earth. Another one is still up there aging. However, Suntory has not publicly stated what they've found from the experiment that's already come down to Earth. So it'll be really interesting to find out what they find, how much the microgravity environment impacted their product. Beer companies have also entered the fray. Actually, many years ago, Sapporo sent up a barley experiment to ISS and eventually brought that back down and made beer based on descendants of that barley, and actually sold it for, I believe, what was it, $150 per six-pack at that time. So very limited run. And the American company, our brewery, Ninkasi, did a bit of a stunt, but it was still interesting. They sent up beer yeast on a sounding rocket, so it technically reached the threshold of space, and have been making beer based on that yeast ever since, called ground control beer. Perhaps the biggest beer company that's gotten involved in the space industry is Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser, the large American beer manufacturer. A couple of years ago at the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas, they had a big press release or big press conference with celebrities and vice presidents from their company, as well as an astronaut, and announced that they wanted to be the first beer manufacturer on Mars. And of course, at the time, we thought it was a publicity stunt. But they have put their money where their mouths are. They have, to this date, they have sent 4 barley experiments up into space to see if they can grow barley, how it will germinate. And this is very important, well beyond whether you want a beer in space, or in my case, want a whiskey in space. It also is a direct investment in agriculture. So companies like Budweiser, if they're investing in barley or other related technologies, they are making a direct investment on capabilities that are required for sustainable human presence. We're not going to have space civilization until we figure out if we can grow crops in space. So it's an interesting project that Budweiser has gotten involved with, and they could be making a dramatic difference in the future of space exploration by investing in these capabilities. Other companies, another beer company, Australian, although it's a collaboration between an American company and an Australian brewery, Vostok Beer also created a space-related beer. Their beer hasn't been in space, but they also saw a problem. Many of you will know that, of course, on Earth, when you have carbonated beverages, the gas in your beer will rise up and disperse into the atmosphere. But in space, it does not do that. The carbonation will actually go to the center of the beverage and slowly start expanding. And it'll do that in your stomach as well. So astronauts who have consumed carbonated beverages have reported stomach cramps and wet burps. But there's also another problem. Astronauts also report that their taste buds are impacted. They feel like they have a head cold, so their taste buds have been diminished. So astronauts typically like spicy foods. Hot sauce is very popular in space. And so this presents a problem with beer manufacturers. If you want your product consumed in space, Vostok was looking at, could you manufacture a beer that would be suitable for space, that would, on one side, have a moderated level of carbonation so that you could consume it. It tasted like beer with the carbonation, but it wasn't enough carbonation to give you stomach cramps, but also would still taste good. So they selected a stout and found the right balance of carbonation. And they've actually tested this on zero-G flights in the United States. I believe they have conducted 3 zero-G flights in the United States to see, first off, how people, if you could consume it in microgravity, without stomach cramps, but also doing experiments on how humans metabolize alcohol in space. And that's an interesting one because as much as I mentioned before, people have consumed alcohol in space, but since it's officially prohibited, there have been no official experiments or testing to see how humans metabolize alcohol in space. We only have anecdotal tales. We're pretty sure that we can consume alcohol in space safely, but we don't know that officially. So Vostok decided to start looking at this problem as well as the carbonation problem. It's not just beer and whiskey manufacturers also. There's also interest in the wine industry. Here's a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson that's in the book that he sent me for the book. After we find space aliens, my next question just might be, is there Burgundy wine elsewhere in the universe? Indeed. So there's also been wine experiments in space. Back in, I believe it was 2005, yeah, it says it right there on the screen, Greg Olson, one of the first space tourists who spent many millions of dollars to go up to ISS, brought some wine grape rootstocks with him. Greg owns a South African vineyard. He makes some wonderful wine, and he decided to see if he could bring up some grapevines with him that he could bring there and then bring back to Earth to grow and eventually make wine based on grapevines that had been in space. I'll quickly just play this video if it'll play. Actually, that's the only point of the thing. He's not actually doing anything with the grapevines. He's just spinning the vial that they're in. The whole point of this was to bring them up to space and bring them back down. But unfortunately, while they survived the trip up into space, they died before they reached the ground. So he was not able to replant those grapevines and make wine from those grapevines right there. Other companies, including a French champagne producer, Maison Mumm, have also entered the fray. And they have a similar problem to Vostok beer. Maison Mumm wanted to create a champagne, a bottle, and a glass that you could consume in microgravity, so that one day when there is space tourism, there are private space stations, people can pop the cork, or probably not do that in space, but open the bottle and toast with their product in space. But, of course, they have the carbonation issue with champagne. But they also wanted to make sure that you could drink it more authentically. Maison Womb did not want future consumers of their product sipping their product out of the microgravity, out of the air. They wanted people to be able to drink it out of glasses. So they also created these little champagne glasses so that they could maintain the conviviality. That's a quote from them, the conviviality of drinking their product in space. So they have actually tested this on 2 microgravity rides on the European version of the zero-G flight. I believe it's Nova Space. And you may notice over on the left, Usain Bolt, the famous Olympian sprinter. They invited him to come along, not only to test out the champagne, but to see if he could do a sprint in microgravity. Apparently it didn't go too well. Other products, that are also in development right now. As I mentioned, the champagne producer was looking at champagne glasses, but there's also a lot of interest in creating cocktail glasses and scotch glasses so you can drink your spirits in space more authentically. On the left of left that I'm facing it, of the screen, you'll see Zero Gravity Cocktail Project. They created a microgravity cocktail glass. Well, so you fill it from the bottom. It goes up to the grooves that you see. Part of fluid dynamics, even in microgravity, fluids will adhere to a surface. So they designed this so it would adhere to the surface, but you could still drink it like you would from a normal cocktail glass. A group called the Open Space Agency that James Pars actually runs also created a similar glass for whiskey, and using a similar technology here. And so they created that several years ago. But this also has an additional use, not just useful for drinking your spirits in space. This has many other uses for just drinking other beverages, but you can imagine how this could be used in other, transporting other types of fluid in a microgravity environment. So once again, by the alcohol industry investing in these technologies, they're also investing in other critical areas of space exploration. Other alcohol companies have also entered the fray, but more in the form of stunts. I don't know how many there have been right now, but there have been at least a couple dozen balloon experiments with companies sending their product up to the edge of space so they could get a spectacular image of their product from a high altitude balloon at around 100,000 feet. In this picture on the top by Natural Light, I believe was the first time a beer manufacturer sent their product up on a balloon. And then even Ardbeg, even though they had an experiment in space, they also sent their bottle up to 100,000 feet on a balloon as well. But I believe several dozen companies have done this, and some of them have tried to mix cocktails in not in microgravity, but in space as well on balloons. However, none of this would be possible without a critical technology, and that would be space agriculture. Without space farming, you're not going to have any manufacturing of alcohol in space. Obviously, you need that feedstock. You need the sugars. You need a biomass to create alcohol. So the book also goes into a lot of detail on some of the projects around the world looking at space agriculture, some of them in space actually as well. So let me bring the slides back up. You can't have alcohol manufacturing in space without a biomass, without growing plants. And there are many groups around the world looking at this problem. One of these projects was actually at the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah. The Mars Society runs that facility. And their crew 149 did experiments trying to grow, I believe it was hops and sorghum and simulated Mars soil. And this is some of the images from the soil right here. And they realized you could grow crops in simulated Mars soil. They realized that it would only grow to an extent without adding an additional nutrient to it, but they pretty much knew that in advance. There are other groups looking at this. NASA has partnered with the International Potato Center in Lima, Peru. Yes, there is such a thing. And they created a group called Potatoes on Mars. And so, literally, they're trying to see if potatoes will grow on Mars, similar to what was depicted in the novel The Martian that Andy Weir wrote. And so they're looking at different strains of potatoes to see which ones will grow in harsh environments. And potatoes grow in a remarkable range of environments here on Earth. So they selected varieties that would grow at high altitudes, at lower temperatures, to see how harsh the conditions would be before the potatoes would no longer grow. Now, they don't expect them to be able to grow on the Martian surface without an environment, but they want to see if they can grow these potatoes in conditions that are far too harsh for humans, but still will grow. That could be extremely beneficial, because if they create an environment, a farm environment on Mars, it'll save a lot of energy if they don't have to make it suitable for human life, only potato life. And of course, if you can make potatoes, you can make vodka. There's also other experiments going on. On the left, there's a greenhouse on ISS, growing lettuce. On the right, there's an image of a satellite that was launched, I believe, last year, Eucropsis, which is simulating both lunar and Mars gravity by spinning and trying to grow tomato seeds. So there is some interesting space agriculture experiments going on right now. And this is pretty much the end of my talk, but I just want to give a little bit of information on the group I'm from, Explore Mars. We run the Humans to Mars Summit every year. As you see, one of the image up top with NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine and Buzz Aldrin at one of my events. As you can see, the slide below lists the Humans to Mars Summit, but that's not taking place in those dates. I should have switched that out. As with everybody else in the world, we are not conducting our conference this upcoming week, but that has been moved to hopefully late August, early September. So if you go to our website, exploremars.org, you'll be able to find out more information on the Humans to Mars Summit. But I want to end with this quote, another quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. And this image here, as you probably heard, they have found huge amounts of alcohol just floating in space in different regions. And so Neil said, ethanol is one of the dozens of organic molecules found in space. Add them all up from one region of the galaxy to the next, and you will have a well-stocked bar. But don't stop there. Your cosmic cocktail will also contain the basic ingredients for life itself. But let's see if this will work. I have one final thing to show, which seems appropriate. Many of you may, I am assuming this probably, I don't know if this played in England or not, but this Heineken commercial, which seems particularly suitable to this talk, if I can get it to play. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you to the British Interplanetary Society. It was fun being on, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.